Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another session of the GUSI webinar series. As a reminder, the GUSI webinar series serves as a platform for the GUSI network members to share experience and expertise in evidence synthesis and to learn about potential collaboration. In case you are using the GoToWebinar for the first time, you can submit your questions and comments using the question panel on the right, or you can wait for the discussion part in the end, and you can press the raise your hand button and we can unmute you so that you can ask your question verbally. Today's webinar is part of the Stakeholder Engagement webinar series, and it's about lessons for introducing stakeholders to environmental evidence synthesis by Jessica Taylor. Jessica Taylor is a project manager at the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation at Carleton University, and she conducts evidence syntheses, including systematic reviews and systematic maps, under the guidance of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence for clients in Canada, including Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Parks Canada, as well as abroad in Sweden and the United Kingdom. Jessica is an endorsed CEE trainer, and since 2017, she has been the Communications Officer for the CEE, and in 2018, she stepped in as the Secretary of the CEE Board of Trustees. Thank you. Jessica, you can start by sharing your screen now.
Okay. Okay. All right, so thank you for that introduction, Zara, and thank you so much to all of you for joining in today. So I'm here today to present to you our paper titled Lessons for Introducing Stakeholders to Environmental Evidence Synthesis, which was written by myself and colleagues Trina Roy-Twinsky, Joe Bennett, and Stephen Cook from the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Decision-Making. So our center is located at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and has grown in the last 3 years from just 2 staff members and our director, Steve Cook, to about 6 staff members and 2 graduate students now. So our center is hosted in Stephen Cook's Fish Ecology and Conservation Physiology Lab. So admittedly, a lot of the work that we do is quite environmental and quite fishy, although we have diversified our projects by collaborating with other groups. So that being said, if some of the examples I give here today are really fish related, that's why. So the paper I'm presenting today was originally published in the Stakeholder Engagement Special Issue of Environmental Evidence Journal and is now available through the journal website and the Stakeholder Engagement in Evidence Synthesis website, which will also host the webinars from this series. So I've included the links there as well. So just to go through the outline of today's presentation, I will go through some of the background and the Canadian context for our lessons. I'll go over the lessons that we've learned over the years, so one of which is advocating for a systematic review with relevant geographical scope and target audience. Second is control for stakeholder mission creep. The third is to establish a mutually beneficial timeline, reduce the potential for biased targeted searches, and manage stakeholder expectations. And then I'll finish by updating you on what we've learned since this paper was published in 2017. So to get started on the background, if you've been tuning into this webinar series, you probably have a good idea already of the definition of stakeholders, but one that is typically and more recently adopted in our field is that from the Hadaway paper that opened this special series on stakeholder engagement, and that is all parties that may affect or be affected by a review. An important factor to consider, though, is that engagement strategies must often be tailored to specific stakeholder groups. So with that in mind, I've brought up the conceptual model presented in that Hadaway paper to show that in our case, our advice that will be described here applies mainly to those involved in the review process, from question definition to review synthesis. So for us at the Canadian CEE Centre, that is going to include decision makers and those who influence policy, research funders, so which are often in our case our federal government, and researchers, which can be academics we invite onto our review teams or scientists within the government. The roles these team members can play in this review often include being an evidence holder, funders, question askers, so this is often the role of the funder or the commissioner of the review, scope influencers, and ultimately users of the review. The types of actions we see from our team members are suggesting sources of literature, submitting articles to be considered in the review, endorsing the review, facilitating access to the review by sharing within their networks. Some may integrate the findings into their decisions, provide funding or in-kind contributions, and most importantly, share their knowledge and experience for the scope and context of the review. As is the case in many countries, in Canada, the concept of formal evidence synthesis in environmental management is an emerging one. Canadian government institutions like Parks Canada and Fisheries and Oceans Canada have a history of using evidence-based advice, although they have only recently begun commissioning formal collaboration for environmental evidence, or CEE, systematic reviews to integrate into their decision-making processes. In the past few years, we have conducted systematic reviews and maps for Parks Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and recently the International Development Research Centre. And while we are still overcoming some timing and funding hurdles, there's a growing interest in evidence synthesis and evidence-based decision-making within these organizations. In fact, one of our very first stakeholders from Parks Canada now sits on the CEE board, and staff from each of these organizations will be in attendance at our international CEE conference that's upcoming in June. I'll get into more on that a little bit later. So with all of this in mind, I will start to get into the 5 lessons to consider when undertaking an evidence synthesis with stakeholders that might be new to the process to help ensure a successful relationship between the review team and stakeholders. So moving on to lesson 1, advocate for an evidence synthesis with relevant geographical scope and target audience. So those that commission and fund systematic reviews in the environmental sector often are interested in questions that have an inherent regional or national focus. However, the literature relevant to a given evidence synthesis may be much broader, such that it is worthwhile and indeed necessary to include data from other jurisdictions. It's important to engage with relevant stakeholders when developing and refining the question and determining the trade-offs with a particular scale. So we're looking at local specificity or broader applicability. When weighing these options, though, it is important to be sensitive to the fact that a funder, for example, a government agency, may not want to spend money on examining literature from the other side of the world. So in this example, which could represent a typical question we may encounter, so for example, say our government wanted to know something about brook trout in Alberta for management purposes. Maybe it's around habitat restoration. What we could do is look at the literature about brook trout management in Alberta. But what might be better is looking at all of the salmonians instead of one species. Looking at it from a taxonomic perspective would give us a larger evidence base to work with while still answering the stakeholders' questions. In this same example, it might make sense to approach things on an eco-regional scale. So this might traverse multiple jurisdictions or even countries. And you could consider looking at this species or family across the world. Or what happens more frequently is looking at this species or family across similar climate zones around the world. When a systematic review is done without a particular jurisdiction as the focal area, the systematic review inherently has a broader value and relevance to the international community. In some cases, even the species or ecosystem, even if they are quite different, the issue itself is germane. So for example, fish removal from lakes. This can happen all around the world and not just in one region. This also applies when the question represents a local knowledge gap, and we have no choice but to use a broader geographical scope to uncover relevant evidence. This decision will ultimately be up to the commissioners of the review, though, so work with your stakeholders to strike an appropriate balance and ensure it fits within your time and resources. So moving on to our second lesson, which is avoiding stakeholder mission creep. This is something that we have run into a lot on our reviews and can be better controlled for right from the beginning. Constructing a clear, carefully articulated question for a review is a crucial step and often necessitates a compromise between comprehensiveness and detail. We find this to be especially true in environmental science and with stakeholders that are new to the process. An overly comprehensive question arising from different opinions can make a systematic review unachievable, especially in the timeframes that are often required by government agencies. Now, although I just mentioned in lesson 1 that some individual stakeholders may adhere to a strong local focus, you can also run into the opposite when working with a diverse team. Involving people from different groups or levels of government can lead to a proliferation of opinions and a variation in personal priorities. We also experience governments that are subject to rapidly changing priorities. If all stakeholders up the chain of command do not have a basic understanding of the strict protocols and rigor of systematic reviews, there can be pressure to design a review with an overly broad or vague question that attempts to string together many disparate elements. Our recommendation here for this is to provide an initial, clear description of the systematic review process and what distinguishes it from a traditional literature review. The third lesson is to establish a timeline that works for all parties right from the beginning. It's very important to discuss and agree on a realistic timeline with those commissioning the review during the early stages. Stakeholders that are new to the rigorous evidence synthesis process may not be aware of the timing of certain stages. This is something that has become especially important with our reviews, as our government stakeholders are typically working with fiscal deadlines, but the time to complete a review can often cross 1 or more fiscal years. Depending on the experience of the funders, training may be beneficial, or at least a discussion about the timeline to conduct a comprehensive review. In these cases, we have introduced other deliverables into the contract to satisfy any accounting needs. Here in Canada, our government fiscal year is April to March. And if a project is going to take multiple years, the stakeholders often require some sort of product in the interim in order to release funding. So in the past, we have created what we called a narrative report. So we deliver this to our stakeholders in March of the year if the full review is not scheduled to be complete. This is a detailed project update that includes descriptive statistics of the literature so far and any preliminary results, or perhaps a subset of the articles so far. Other interim deliverables could include giving presentations, webinars, or holding update meetings. Regardless of the type of deliverable, it is important to discuss these early and often to ensure everyone involved has clear expectations. Our fourth lesson is to reduce the potential of bias-targeted searches. Often the search strategy of a systematic review includes conducting targeted searches for the more difficult to find gray literature. These sources of information can be identified through consultation with stakeholders, with the network of experts leading the systematic review, and the broader community via social media or email solicitations. If this isn't executed well, individually driven searches can lead to bias in the derived literature set. If, for example, searches are in a particular geographical region or research areas. For example, at the early stage of a systematic review, to reduce the potential for biased advice on where to uncover new sources of information, we recommend forming an advisory team made up of stakeholders and experts that is both geographically balanced to the extent possible and diverse in regards to their backgrounds, views, and skill sets. So for example, academics, practitioners, topic experts, review experts. If this team is unbalanced, it may encourage you to pursue information in one or a few narrowly focused directions. You can also run into issues if these suggestions come later in the review, when there isn't sufficient time to follow up on all of the potential sources of information. These situations need to be discussed early to ensure that the suggested sources of information will be considered, but be conscious of weighting effort across all identified sources of information. And now on to the final lesson of our paper, managing stakeholder expectations. So two common expectations we have encountered when introducing stakeholders to evidence synthesis are that, one, all research will be included in the narrative and/or quantitative synthesis, and two, a quantitative synthesis will be conducted. We have learned that frequent communication between project leaders and those commissioning the systematic review is essential at all stages of the review process to set and manage expectations for the final review product. What is particularly important for those leading the review to explain to the commissioners is that even if it is determined that there is sufficient research on a given topic, this does not mean that all of the existing relevant research is of the same quality or in fact usable. In this example flow diagram here, you can see that there were 75 studies included in the review, but only 24 made it to quantitative analysis. And this discrepancy might need to be explained to your stakeholders. From the beginning and throughout the review, it will be important to remind stakeholders that ultimately it is the quantity and quality of the existing literature that dictates the final review product. An approach that we are using to help set and manage expectations is to provide training in the form of workshops for the commissioners to introduce the role of systematic reviews in evidence-based management and to familiarize them with the steps in the systematic review process by explaining what each of these steps involves and why it is important. Ideally, this happens at the very beginning of the process. So to finish things off today, I'd like to add a couple of bonus lessons that we have learned in the last few years since publishing this paper. The first is to consider time for revisions and publication. Publishing in an academic journal can be a lengthy process to begin with, especially if there are multiple rounds of revisions. What we have found as we wrap up projects and prepare to submit the manuscript to a journal is that the revision process within a team can take longer than expected, as often our team members are very busy. For a manuscript to make the rounds through a diverse advisory team may take weeks or months. And to add to that, if there are any major issues brought up, for example, in decisions regarding analysis or interpretation of data, it can create a lengthy discussion and even disagreements within the team that will need to be resolved. It is firstly important to consider this process when outlining your timeline from the beginning. For example, does submission to a journal happen before or after contract close? Because at that point you will be at the mercy of others at that stage. We recommend establishing an understanding from the beginning that there will be a set time for revisions and that this will need to be adhered to in order to meet deadlines. This could be, for example, one round through the authors and then it is up to you to reconcile as authors, or give authors a maximum of 1 month to provide comments or feedback, depending on your situation. The second is to expect changes in the advisory team members. As I've mentioned earlier, from the beginning, the team involved in the review is carefully chosen for a specific reason, whether that be their expertise, a region or jurisdiction they represent, or diversity in backgrounds or views. However, you may experience changes in the availability of team members to participate throughout the project. You may see people retire, go on leave, switch departments and therefore their priorities, or move into roles where they can no longer commit time to the project. Regardless of the reason, it's important to consider the effect this can have on your team and consider appropriate replacements if necessary. We have often had the team member recommend a replacement for themselves, and maybe this is the person taking over their role in their organization. So I'd like to thank all of those who have contributed to our reviews over the last few years and for learning with us as we navigate new relationships in evidence synthesis. And finally, to finish things off, I'd like to end by inviting you all to the 3rd International Conference of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence that will be hosted by our team here in Ottawa next June. The Environmental Evidence Summit will include 2 days of training in evidence synthesis and 3 days of conference with presentations from people around the world. If you are interested, please visit our website for more information or get in touch. Registration and abstract submission is now open. Thank you to Gessie for this opportunity and thank you all for tuning in.